Connecticut's history of government-perpetuated segregation by reducing social, economic, and health disparities experienced by low-income families of color and generating access to opportunity by establishing pathways to affordable housing in thriving communities. I mean, that mission is certainly a lofty and important mission. And I can say that Erin is the right person to lead this organization in getting that work done. So Erin came to the Open Communities Alliance with a great deal, almost 20 years of experience. Erin, good for you. It goes fast, right? It's hard to believe. This was her vision to how do we change what's happening in the state of Connecticut. And she understands it's through communities on the grassroots level. So she's been committed to working on issues of equality. She has extensive experience in dealing with issues in housing, fair housing, and then as she was deputy director at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, she spearheaded the work on opportunity and race. Erin is truly one of the thought leaders in the areas of zoning, equity, opportunity, and affirmatively furthering fair housing. Erin, welcome to and I will turn everything over to you. Erin will speak for about 30 minutes. We'd like to reserve questions until after her presentation, and then there'll be plenty of time for back and forth. Erin.
All right, thank you. It's great to be here. And Yvonne, I think you may need to go down to the screen share function and give me permission to share my screen to put up the presentation.
Yes, Caitlin will do that because she opened the meeting. Is Erin upset?
Let me know if it works. I think I just did it.
Yeah, it looks like it's working. Yep. Okay. All right. There we go. All right. Well, it's great to be here, and I am going to try to get through the slides as efficiently as I can so that we can spend some time on conversation. Yvonne already shared the sort of goals of our organization. You know, one thing I'll just share, since she already described our work, is I'll point out something obvious. I'm a white woman doing work on racial equity issues, and you know, it's a role that I try to undertake somewhat humbly. It's something it's an experience that means I'm always learning and trying to always listen. I come to this from a family history of being involved in the civil rights movement. My parents were very active. And that meant that ultimately in their jobs, my mother was a teacher in the public schools in Washington, D.C. My father ran an organization called the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Just meant the conversations around our dinner table at night and the community that we were a part of were all about civil rights and the impact that the history of segregation and discrimination has had on Black and Latino families, but families of color more generally as well. I also attended the DC public schools where my graduating class from high school was about 87% kids of color. And that's an experience I think every white person should have. And it doesn't mean I know what it is to be a person of color, but I think it gives me a little bit of the tip of the iceberg sense. And it did mean that I came out of of high school with a really nice diversity of friends, and I think an understanding of some of their challenges in life in various ways, and also saw some real inequities. Both in terms of the kinds of resources that we had in our schools compared to suburban and private schools, but also inequities in the kinds of opportunities that some of my friends had that others didn't. So that absolutely shaped my experience to do that in a shorthand way. When I played basketball in junior high, my nickname was Larry Bird. And that wasn't because I was really good. we come to our work thinking first about the history and how we got here. This is Darien. This is what's called a redlining map. I think this is the notion of what redlining was is becoming more and more something that people are seeing every day. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with it, redlining was a process led by the federal government that started in the 1930s that was designed to rate neighborhoods, to assess whether the government should be making, that's when the government was getting into making home loans and financing home loans and also homeowners insurance. So the government was trying to figure out, is this a good bet? Should I be investing in this neighborhood or that neighborhood? They were assessing the risk. And one of the factors for assessing the risk was who lived in the neighborhood. And in this, so the way they split it up is it was like a stoplight. You've got red, meaning a real problem, yellow meaning maybe a problem, and then an unusual stoplight that has blue in it, blue, and then green, meaning this is a great place to invest. And so in this D zone, this red line zone that was graded as something that was a concern in Darien, on the left here, you see what that rating was based on. They were worried about the character of occupant and improvement, meaning, sort of the conditions of the building. Mostly day laborers in this neighborhood. In this case, 70% Italian. I think that's a percentage rather than a sheer number, but I guess we could explore that. And then 5% Negro. So a lower population of Blacks at that time in Darien. And I just wanted to compare it to a redlined area in New Haven where they talk about the age and obsolescence of the dwellings and the character of the inhabitants as well. And in that case, the neighborhood was 70% Negro and 30% foreign born. So, who was living in the neighborhood was absolutely part of how the neighborhood was rated. Another process that was put in place, a policy that was permitted, were racial covenants. So these were covenants that were basically part of deeds that limited who could live in housing. And in this case, this is a deed from High Ledge Homes in West Hartford. And the language that was used there is from 1940 that was really used throughout the state is no person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or a tenant. And of course, that's clear. The goal there is completely clear. And these racial covenants were declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court in the case of Shelley versus Kramer in 1948. But the court didn't say they were illegal. So actually they could continue on in the deeds even after that case and technically were legal up through 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. And the reason all of this is important is think about how inheriting homes. And I think about my parents' home that they purchased in about 1967, so before the Fair Housing Act was passed, in a white neighborhood that I'm sure was white, partly because of, if not racial covenants, then a practice to enforce racial covenants. And that property accumulated in value far more than an equivalent property in a mostly Black neighborhood. And when my siblings and I inherit that home someday, that's going to be our basically white privilege in dollars. So even though some of this seems like a really long time ago, it has relevance today. And I'm going to have to let my dog out of the room real quick. She'll come back and the door will look like a ghost is opening it, but that's the living in COVID times. So the other piece of this that's really important. Sorry, did someone have a comment? The other piece of this that's really important is zoning. And this is something that Yvonne, in her role as commissioner, was really focused on in a way that I don't know if any commissioner had been focused on it so, you know, to such a great extent prior to that. But the ability for towns to focus on zoning as something that they were able to have some say over came from the case Euclid versus Ambler in 1926 in the Supreme Court. And it's a case that basically said, sure, towns, you know, first your authority to zone is delegated from the state, but once you have that and are following those rules, you can decide that there are residential zones and commercial zones and half-acre lots and 5-acre lots. That's up to you. You're protecting the health and safety. And that's always been the understanding of zoning, is that you're protecting welfare, health, safety. And that's all that's in the Supreme Court decision. But if you look at the district court decision that led up to that decision, this is what the judge said. The blighting of property values and the congesting of population whenever the colored or certain foreign races invade a residential section are so well known as to be within the judicial cognizance. So clearly, race, again, was a big part of what was going on here, and the reason that zoning was used. It was used and okay with the courts to keep people, certain people, out. Another thing that came into play was discrimination, and that's something that has, you know, existed for a long time. And this is sort of a complicated slide, but basically it shows on the right different studies of discrimination over time, with the early ones being in the 1970s, and just showing that when compared to whites, blacks, for example, in that first example with the arrow, 30% of the time the white applicant received a more favorable treatment than the black applicant when looking for housing. And in different forms that has been true over time. And you know, it's gone a little bit underground recently in recent years, but it's still a factor. And all of this cumulatively together has meant that Blacks and Latinos have less income, and well, less income comes from a lot of other factors, including employment discrimination, but less wealth. And you know, historically, Blacks and Latinos have earned about 50% or less of what whites have earned, but have about 10% of the wealth. And this slide comes from Forbes, an article from Forbes that is predicting going forward that Blacks and Latinos will have about 1% of the wealth of whites. So that's what in part brings us back to this notion of affordable housing, and how do we reverse this? Affordable housing is a big part of that because of this wealth and income disparity. And it's also part of what connects all of this to the need for affordable housing. Connecticut is one of the most expensive housing states in the country. We have the 9th highest housing wage, meaning that a family would have to work 99 hours a week at a minimum wage to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So we have an affordable housing crisis, but we also have a housing segregation crisis. We're one of the most segregated states in the country. And you can see on this map that the reddish brown areas are the most segregated places. So Connecticut is more segregated than any place in the South. And we're on par with Detroit, Los Angeles, Kansas City, Milwaukee, and Chicago, also the whole New York and Philadelphia area. So these are two really severe problems that have an impact on